Thank y'all for coming out. I'm gonna show a lot of different projects kind of quickly. I'm gonna show some videos and then we can have a conversation or just hang out and I could show more videos. So I run an art space in Los Angeles. Just some examples of recent projects. This was a workshop for parents and children on how to steal cars. This was a performance for one dentist and one dental patient. Dance performance by 6 women who are 8.5 months pregnant inside of a church that was shaped like a giant onion. A butter making aerobics class where participants shake cream while doing an aerobics workout. The original idea for this, which totally didn't work, was this sort of circular economy that you would be able to consume as many calories as you had burned off. But then when we did the math, it would be like a parsimonious thumbnail of butter. And so everybody ends up coming out behind from a caloric burning standpoint. It's a concert by bees. And then the next project I'm going to show is a short video, which is a vacation for houseplants.
I like the idea of giving the plant some nourishment, and I thought a change of venue could be really nice for my plants. You know, the plant stays in one place all the time, and just a change of scenery might be really nice for the plant.
Had you participated in other programs for plants before?
Never. I had never taken my plant on vacation. My plant had never really gone on a trip.
The piece was called Houseplant Vacation, and the idea was to have people bring their houseplants to the museum for a month. And while the houseplants were there, we had different programming directed towards the plants. So everything from poetry readings to we brought a psychic in to do some psychic work with the plants, and we had music. For the plant vacation, I was really interested in what happens when you have a participatory piece. So there's an artist develops a project and you have somebody participating in the project, but you also have this third audience, which are people who are watching the participation. And I got really interested in how, in those experiences, watching somebody participate in a piece, you're kind of imagining what it's like for them, or you're sort of imagining yourself in that role. And with the plant vacation, I was really interested in what would happen if you made a participatory piece where the participants were such an alien subjectivity that you couldn't imagine what the experience they were having was like, and that you would be on the outside of that. Houseplant vacation seemed like these 3 perfect words that when you get that in like the subject line of an email, or you hear somebody saying that, it like instantly conjures up some kind of image, but the image doesn't explain the specifics of it or how it works. And I think that's something that I like in that project, is that
the basics of bringing a plant to the museum for a vacation, you kind of get, but then the why and the how and what happens and what's the underlying discussion about that takes like a long time to unfold.
So there's like a moment in that video where there's like a guy in a corduroy suit, and he's sort of talking to the plants, and that was a really interesting experience. About halfway through the show, I got an email from this guy who's like, "Oh, I'm a conceptual artist from San Francisco." Has a really great name for a conceptual artist, with his Jonathan Keats. And he said, "I make pornography for plants." And so what he does is he films honeybees pollinating plants, and then he rebroadcasts it on plants with a high contrast projector so they can sense the light. I was like, oh, that sounds great. Let's add that to the show. And I think that's a good example of what I'm really interested in, which is a high degree of porosity. Like, you can imagine if you went down to see the Carnegie International show and you're like, hey guys, I got a painting that would fit in great in here. We'll just put it right here. That's probably not gonna happen, right? Anybody? Yes? So I'm interested in this idea that projects' boundaries are maybe fairly fluid, that stuff can kind of come into projects and go out of projects at different stages in their process. And I'm also interested in a very straightforward strategy of making projects very simple and accessible and fun on the surface, and that gives you a place to kind of pack in some more complex or interesting ideas kind of underneath for people who want to dig into them a little bit. So in that project with the plants, I was really interested in this thing of the poetic utterance that, like, if I'm here reading a love poem and the subject of address is you, like, I love you even more than pizza, you're not going to think that you individually, like, you're not going to think that I love you more than pizza. I, in fact, love pizza more than I love you, but you're overhearing this utterance, but it's complicated because you're also the person that's addressed. So that's something that I'm interested in a lot of these projects, about thinking about who is being addressed by the project and what does it mean to be inside that or outside of that or around that. So typically I'm most invested in events, one-day things, short-term things, but at the space that I run in LA, we also do larger scale interventions, which play with this idea of porosity that I was talking about a little bit earlier. So we did a project with an artist, Josh Beckman, where he wanted to teleport this sailboat into our gallery. So it's sort of like The Fly. It had like arrived kind of at the wrong angle and was coming out of the floor. And then that project becomes a site for a lot of different artists to develop ideas or experiments in. So we had a bunch of kids from the neighborhood come over and write a pirate movie, which we shot for them there. Or we did this opera for dogs, which is the next video I'm going to show you.
Day-to-day that's good.
My name is Elizabeth Klein, and I created Tragedy on the Sea Nymph, an operetta in 3 acts starring all dog cast. The dog opera came about real literally because I'm obsessed with my dog Simone, the star of the opera, La Diva, and also I'm a big opera fan. love the idea that people would be able to experience the piece with their dogs. So dogs would also be able to see themselves represented. I was really interested in having this very complex scenario where people would be walking into the silent film with 9 people performing. There's a conductor, a string quartet, and 5 singers to match the 5 dogs in the piece. I think the thing I love most about opera is that you really have to give yourself over to it completely. One thought about an action or a memory of a person could go on for an entire act. And I like to think that that's similar to the life of dogs. I wanted to find a way, I think, to honor those 2 things in a really sincere way.
So when I started the project in 2003, I really wanted to respond to a model of arts education I'd just come out of, which is the studio model, where the sort of message is like, okay, I want you to go in a little white room all by yourself for 2 years and then come out with some object that's completely unique in the world. And I felt that really privileged a kind of art making, which was directly connected to making, you know, vehicles for global capital for the 1%, and wasn't connecting to the things I was really interested in, which is how do ideas circulate in our culture and how do we make those ideas together. And so the name of the space, Machine Project, had this idea that rather than a gallery being a site of display for things that were made somewhere else, it could be a machine for people thinking. And of course, a college is very much, a university is very much the same thing as well. But I wasn't about to start a university, and I was also interested in what would it be like to think about some ideas that were interesting from education and add them to a more porous or informal or ongoing process. So, you know, you're born, you spend a lot of time in school, and your job during that time is to think about ideas with people. And then you're done with school, and your job is to who knows do what, make money, have kids, try and get a different job. And so I started thinking about how could you preserve some of these ways in which knowledge is generated among a community, but do it in an informal, drop-in, low-budget, storefront-y kind of way. And so the space became a place for investigating the various things that people do, whether it's music or poetry or food or technology or things like that, with a lot of the focus being on people doing things with each other. So with each other sometimes means in a, I don't know, like the way we understand participatory art, that there's an audience and they are making a work of art or they're participating in a work of art together, that the audience is part of what constructs the material. So this process, project by Liz Glynn, 24-hour Roman reconstruction, people who came to this event over the course of 24 hours rebuilt the architectural history of Rome. And then at the end of 24 hours, we're told, okay, you're the invading Visigoths, and then sort of a 20-second riot and everybody trampled the installation. But I'm as interested in this idea of people doing things together as thinking about what's the relationship between a performer and an audience, and what are ways you can play with that or experiment with that or interrogate that. So, well, this model, right? There's like one dude and he's talking and there's a bunch of people politely listening. Maybe this works for certain kinds of information transmission, like maybe you're figuring out something about me by how I stand here and whether I'm nervous or I'm not nervous or how I talk. But it seems like there must be a lot of other ways that humans can kind of do stuff together. And I started thinking about what that meant in context of some of the art forms I was interested in. So poetry, for example, I'd been following, and I realized the poetry format is incredibly rigid. There's one poet, the reading's about 20 minutes long, there's probably 4 people there, Afterwards, you get your book signed for a minute, and that's your interaction. So this project was a riff on that, which was to have these two poets in the basement, and there was a hole in the floor, and you could put a word suggesting a poem in an envelope along with a tip. And depending on the size of the tip would be the length of your poem. So if it was 50 cents, maybe you'd have a 4-word poem. And they would read that poem to you through this tube, and you would see them through this hole in the floor. And so this model, which happens in art openings all the time, maybe one or two people is looking at a work of art and everybody else is sort of socializing with each other, was explicitly broken out here. That one person would be literally the only person having the aesthetic experience at a time, and then the rest of the people would be kind of communicating with each other. And something that came out of this that's become of a great point of interest for me with event-based programming is how you cannot know what's going to happen in an event until you have an audience there. So that you can think about events which happen with the site or the gallery or the context as one part of a triangle, the artist, the idea, the performance, the action is the other corner of the triangle, and then the audience and who shows up is the third part. And it's only when you gather those things together does an idea really emerge out into the culture. What I find really exciting about that is audiences are completely unpredictable variables. You can't know what's going to happen until you actually do the thing. And this is my argument. My argument is that basically this is what alternative spaces, however you define that term, should be doing, which is presenting ideas to the culture which are not already conventionally understood as successful. You think about a contemporary art museum. I often think that they are named a little bit, their naming is a little misleading. They should be called museums of places that a bunch of people already decided was really good and important. Because things don't emerge into an art museum context until there's a whole level of decision making taking place. So I was much more interested in being present at this moment where things are happening that may suck, right? And that's exciting to be there at that point. However, if you're gonna say that, like, we're having a space where a lot of the stuff may be terrible, you have to redefine in a certain way your relationship to the idea of how you evaluate what you do. And in this way, like, I feel like I draw, maybe it's my context, but to draw a metaphor from like the sciences, if you take a bunch of stuff and you throw it in a bucket and it explodes, you learn something. If you throw it in that bucket, it doesn't explode, you still learn something. And so as someone who's interested in how humans relate to each other through culture, I like this model that you kind of can't go wrong. So I designed this very simple diagram, which I feel like kind of explains my ethos, which is that any event that we do can be kind of mapped on these two axes. So the horizontal one, is it generating new information, new ways of thinking about the world, or is it addressing something which is familiar and traditional? And the vertical one is the audience's experience of it enjoyable, or is it kind of awkward and uncomfortable? And I feel like you should be hitting all over the place. That if you look back at the course of a year of programming and it's not hitting in all four of these quadrants, then you're not really doing very much interesting work with your project. And I think what happens is if you're constrained for whatever reason, from personal ego or from institutional ideals, that you always have to end up in the upper right quadrant, it makes it hard to actually do very much interesting at all. So I sort of like to replace the model of evaluating things in terms of success and failure with one that's more about the idea of process. So sometimes the idea of process manifests in the work in terms of material processes. Something from one show ends up in the next one. So for example, we did a project where Christy McCaffrey and Sarah Newey, two artists, turned the gallery into a forest. And we had moonlight poetry readings, and maple syrup came out of the trees, and we made pancakes, and we had a thing where you could bring your children to be photographed in nature because we're in Los Angeles and there's allegedly no nature. And at the end, we had a gallery full of genuine trash, right? So you make this beautiful artificial forest, and then you have 2 dumpsters worth of the supplies, which is super depressing on a lot of levels. So Liz, who had done the Roman reconstruction project, and this other artist, Nate Page, proposed that we could recycle the materials to the audience, that we would say, anyone on our mailing list, if there's anything you need or want, try and describe it, and we'll try and make it out of the leftovers. So maybe you need an end table, maybe you need a lamp. This person wanted a handbag made of AstroTurf. And the deal was that you would get these objects for free, but you had to agree not to throw them out. And so this becomes a very practical decision about how do you use the stuff from one show to the next. But then it's also this weird operation of dumping your karmic trash debt onto your audience, like it's some bizarre carbon credit. And stuff, what happens, we'll do a show, something ends up in the basement, and then 4 years later, it turns into the next show. But it's more common or more interesting that the ideas which are generated unexpectedly from one project become the foundational principle for the next one. So we noticed over time, one of the ways we stay in business is much like a school, we teach classes and people pay money to take them. So we noticed that when we first started teaching electronics, it would be nicely gender balanced, and then the 10th time it would be not so balanced. And we would teach sewing or crafts, and at first it'd be gender balanced, and then it tended to bifurcate out to all women doing craft and all men doing electronics. My theory on why this is, by the way, is like more adventuresome people are less connected to their expected gender roles, so they go and do stuff the first time. People are more anxious, wait till later. So we thought that might be interesting to try and work around that. So Brian Crabtree and Kelly Kane designed this workshop where you start with wool, you learn how to dye it with natural fibers from our neighborhood, you sew it into a soft sculpture, you then design a circuit that makes sounds, you solder that circuit together, and then you combine them together. So this is like a soft calculator that if you squeeze, it makes like bleepy bloopy noises. And we found that was a really successful way to combine these different audiences together. So for the next project, which we did at the Berkeley Art Museum, we tried to amplify this idea that you would come for something you were comfortable with and then learn about something you weren't so familiar with. So we did a project called the Machine Project Confusatron. And the way it worked is that there were workshops, drop-in workshops on kimchi making, plant cloning, electronics, and tranimal drag makeup, with tranimal drag makeup being a kind of extreme form of drag influenced by Leah Bowery that sort of interrogates the space between human and non-human as much around gender. So you show up, make some kimchi, get a really extreme makeover, learn something about plants. And I'll show you a short video documenting that now. My name is Mark Allen. I'm the director of Machine Project. Started it about 8 years ago. From the very beginning of Machine Project, I got very interested in how do you shift people's relationship to the things that constitute their world. Almost all aspects of our existence, you're always surrounded by things that were made by some crazy process that you have no understanding of. We did something called the Confusatron, and the idea of it is that we do a lot of workshops at Machine, which are popular but withdraw kind of specific audiences. And so my thought with it was to bring together 4 different workshops that we had done that would kind of bring different kinds of people together. So we did electronics, plant cloning, tranimal makeup, which is a style of drag makeup, and kimchi making. I think that that process of actually doing something yourself and making something yourself produces a different kind of relationship to the knowledge. It's not necessarily that there's a set body of information that every single person needs to get, but it's more about their engagement with the process.
This is called our ground. That is what makes this a complete circuit.
Part of the interest was to try and do something that wouldn't necessarily have a separation between performer and audience. There's the people running the workshops, but it's kind of whoever is coming constitutes the piece. And I think we saw that work in a really dramatic way with the tranimal stuff because it's so theatrical.
My name's Austin Young, and I'm one of the creators of the Tranimal Workshop.
And my name's Squeaky Blonde. I'm one of the creators of Tranimal Workshop also, and I'm an artist.
And I think really, truly, it's about like creativity, like in the moment. You know, I can't even like express that enough, because it's really, we set up a situation where anything could happen, and it does, you know, and you give the space for it. And then people who are participating are the ones who are being the canvases for this process.
I got my start doing performance art and drag in San Francisco at this place called Tranny Shack. I sort of wanted to take not necessarily stop doing regular drag, but I wanted to do something else. For me personally, initially, like I wanted to keep my beard and still have the pretty eyes and stuff, and sort of keep that like, I always call it like a little guttery quality, kind of like dirty, and kind of just using like garbage and making something that's maybe like a costume that maybe will only get worn once and will only look good once, because it'll be destroyed at the end of the night. And it's sort of just kind of evolved from that. We really honestly we had a couple of craft nights, and like we sat here and we were making, I guess,
Goiters.
Just stitching goiters with
we came up with the idea to give goiters, and then we came up with the idea that we could change the shape of people's faces by adding, like, you know,
stuffing them like dolls, and then actually painting on top of it and using the nylon as a bit of a canvas. So that's the fun of it, is using anything you find to make something interesting and beautiful. And there's almost that childlike playfulness of like being a kid and having craft night, you know, but then like elevating it to like, you can wear that to the club too.
Did you guys dress up as kids? Like
Kind
I did, yeah.
Yeah?
We still do.
Yeah.
I don't dress up, so I'm the straight man.
Me too, bro.
Yeah.
I was invited to give a talk at this 6th grade school where they bring artists in to give talks to the students. And because I'm both a busy guy and a really lazy guy, I just gave the same talk I always give. And as I'm showing this video with these giant, bizarre, monstrous fake breasts, and the audience of 6th graders is giggling in that kind of semi-hysterical way, like, ha, ha, ha. And I had that kind of floating above my consciousness moment where I'm like, what am I doing here? And then I invited my friend Emily Lacey to come with me, who's my long-term collaborator, to do like a sound performance. And she does these sort of like, I don't know, like Diamanda Galas yelling, looping sound thing. And we had turned all the lights down, and I was sitting on the side, and I heard I heard the door open, then I heard one of the teachers say like, oh shit, there's the principal. So afterwards I was like, oh, well, that was kind of weird and not thought out by me very well. And this little guy came up to me. And, you know, it's this time where it's like, some of the boys are this tall and some of them are like this tall. And he came up to me, he's like, yeah, I really like your project. There's a lot of stuff like what you do in Portland. I'm like, oh, that's cool. If, you know, you live in Portland. Like, why am I asking a 6th grade if he lives in Portland, by the way? He obviously lives in California. It's like, no, but I've seen that TV show Portlandia. So he apparently had thought both Portlandia was a documentary and I should be on it. So it's like a double burn. And then the next day I got a phone call at the gallery, and this woman said, oh, well, apparently you were at my daughter's school yesterday. And then I was like, oh no, here it comes. And then she said, well, now she really is demanding that you do her birthday party. And I was like, well, we don't really do birthday parties. And she's like, well, why did you come to the school then? Well, after that, I met a woman, and she asked to do a birthday party for her 90-year-old mother, and we did that one. So I think my policy is birthdays under 10 and over 90. That's what I'm going to stick with. So this idea of one thing leading to another is actually kind of in that anecdote, but this idea of process is one I've also been thinking a lot about in terms of documentation. So I've shown you guys a couple of videos, and what I've really been thinking about with the videos is how to think of them as like a parallel work that we do with the artist, so that not that the performance is the real thing and the video is the representation of the real thing, but there's sort of two different vehicles for ideas to circulate out there. And I've been thinking about this increasingly across all of our documentation. So we just did a show in San Antonio where I commissioned 14 designers to do posters for events based just on the videos that they saw afterwards. So rather than a poster being something designed before an event to promote it, I was interested in this idea of how would a designer interpret something they hadn't seen just through seeing the video of the performance. And then the installation was all the posters and the videos. But I wanted to just show you one of the posters and then quickly show you the video that it is based on. So there's the poster. And then here's the video.
I think I'm going to do that then. I'm going to go on the right side by the backs of the cars. So that way if the cars are coming down, they can still go around. It's just going to be about going up that hill and then capping it off at the top of the hill.
Great.
Happy to get the summer off, so every time I update my Twitter,
I've been terribly alone and forgotten in Manhattan. I'm going home to my city by the bay. I left my heart in San Francisco, high on a hill. It calls to me. I'm halfway to the stars. The morning falls. Way to the air. My love waits there. It's San Francisco, above the blue and windy sea. When I come home to you, San Francisco, your golden sun will shine for me. Thanks.
So now you can see the poster and interpret it. Okay, so this is I have more videos, but I'm going to attempt to see if you have any questions, and if you don't, we'll just watch more videos. So we have an out if that turns out to be a super awkward proposition. But let's give it a try. Does anybody have any questions? When I first started doing this project, I was constantly having like a personal identity anxiety attack when people would ask me what I did, and I would say, well, I'm an artist, kind of, let's not talk about it, because I couldn't kind of figure out what I was and what the project was. And over time, I've decided that is the greatest strength. I think that there's such a pressure to say, I am this, I am a banker. And I think it really limits your ability to do interesting things in the culture. It's uncomfortable to be in like a ambiguous space, but I think remaining ambiguous is very powerful. And the ways in which this is manifested for us is that we, in a way, become a kind of screen people can project what they want out of culture onto. So if like you're very invested in technology, you may think of machine projects like, oh, they're kind of a hacker space. If you're very into like community events, you're like, well, they're like a community center. So on one level, that's useful just for how you can bring a lot of audiences in. The second thing is that we operate, and I think we do this most aggressively of any organization that I know of in the United States, both as like a nonprofit container for art to happen in. It's kind of what the storefront is, and as a ambiguously structured art collective that goes out and does projects in other places. So that when we are working with the Hammer Museum or the Walker Museum, we're very much there as artists. When we are at the storefront, it's perceived as sort of being a nonprofit, like an alternative space that things can happen in. And the other thing that's interesting about that to me is the way in which the name Machine Project as an organization gets invited to do things in museums, but it's no guarantee of who's going to show up. So that allows me to bring artists who maybe have never done projects in a museum before into that context through the larger organizing principle of Machine Project. And I think that the two things that allow us to do that is, one, a willingness to sustain ambiguity about what we are. And the second is a fairly, what's the word I want to use? What's someone who does something for a pragmatic approach to organization? That there's vertical ways in which organizations run, and there's horizontal ways in which organizations run. And often those methods of structuring a group of people are chosen for ideological reasons or just from force of habit. Like, well, I run the military, so we're going to be organized in this way. Like, well, I run a food collective, so we're going to be organized in this way. And what we try and do is pragmatically pull from those different systems as best needed to make stuff happen, because the goal is always to try and make stuff happen. Yes, thank you. I think it functions in three primary fashions. One, the most straightforward way is the project is started, I work with 1 million artists, but it's also very much to amuse me. So my sensibility infects a lot of the projects. Strategically, I'm really interested in humor as a vehicle for accessibility. So my goal is to make a project that every single human on the planet is interested in, but has enough depth of ideas that anybody could dig much deeper into if they wanted. And I'm really thinking about how does an audience deal with the unfamiliar or the unexpected? And there's two core human responses to the unexpected. One of them is like, oh, wow, I feel really uncomfortable here. I wish I'd never come to this, eco-terrorist poetry reading. I really don't belong here, and everybody's going to know it. And the other is like, oh my God, what is that weird thing over there? I'm going to touch it and taste it right now. So I find comedy is a good way to get the second response out of people, or to allow people to connect to content of complexity they might not normally feel intellectually eligible to attack. And then the third point I have forgotten. It was a good one though. Oh, parody. My method for producing projects is to think about the variables and just change one of them. Like, there's only two strategies I really use, which is take something that doesn't go with something else and put it with it, or to find one variable and to change it. So if a concert is normally by humans, what if the bees do the concert? If a vacation is normally for humans, what if the plants go on vacation? Well, my strategy seems even more simplistic once I start describing it. Switch humans with something else. Yeah, thing minus human plus something else equals machine project. So some of it is just the things that maybe seem like parodies are they're not about mocking anything, because my strategy is always and. It's not or, but it's switching a variable. And so sometimes when you do that, it makes it seem like it's a parody of something else. Just in the way like a dog wearing clothes can be interpreted as a parody of human mores and mannerisms, but it's also perhaps charming in itself to see a dog in clothes. A topic for a longer discussion. Thank you for that question. Yes. Yes, thank you. Well, you know, it's just like you do a lot of homework, so you learn this stuff for the test. And so if you have an event-based practice, it's much easier just to have a general comfort level with stuff going wrong. Because I've probably done 2,000 events in my life. Even if 90% of them are terrible, I have enough of like a curatorial blackout, I can't even remember them. So one thing is just like doing a lot of stuff changes the stakes in a way. Whereas if you're a curator who does exhibits, you might only do like 20 in your lifetime. So if half of them are terrible, you're very sad. The other part of it is that I'm really interested in art practice as a kind of, well, if I can get slightly deep-ish, I think of it as a spiritual practice. How do you find the things in life that you are uncomfortable with or curious about and force yourself to kind of interact with them? So for me, like when I'm putting on an event and it's going awkwardly wrong, it is crushing to my heart. I feel so embarrassed, even though I'm not even the artist, and I'm trying to deal with that by just doing it over and over again and learning how to be present to those awkward, uncomfortable feelings. I think more of you here are probably, well, you're probably 50-50, like people who have some experience teaching and people who don't. But one of the things that's weird about teaching and my job, this is my hobby as a teacher, is that you're constantly in a situation where it's just like, oh, that went horribly. And the students hate me and think I'm an idiot. Why do I do this? But then you realize maybe 5 years later, they'll say like, oh, that was a really good experience. So some of it is like being kind of in the long-term part of it. With institutions, it's very difficult. In my experience, cultural institutions are very risk averse, and there's the representation of risk or the representation of failure, which is very comfortable with, but actually things being bad, nobody likes that. So I try to be very upfront about that. It's like an institutional value for us. And, you know, to the last question, like some really memorable failures, that's great for anecdotal sense, but I literally do have curatorial blackouts where I don't remember the stuff that hurt. So I can't come up with any good ones. Oh, that's a nice question. Thank you. At the storefront in LA, we're currently, well, I've always had this, usually around October 28th, I say, oh, I meant to do a haunted house. But by then it's too late. So this year, ahead of time, I met a really incredible artist named Chris Weisbart, who is a designer at the Natural History Museum in LA. And he's designed this show, which is sort of this series of reveals. So it looks, when you open the Door Machine Project, it looks like we've gone out of business and we've been replaced by a 99-cent store that's maybe this deep. And then you go into, there's a door to the bathroom, and you go in there, and the lights are kind of flickering, and there's a sink with a mirror, and it's actually two-way glass, and behind the mirror there's a puppeteer with a glowing brain and eyeballs, so you see that. And then in the corner, the toilet's been smashed, and there's a hole in the wall. And you go through the hole in the wall, and the interior of the gallery's been turned into a cave that has all these Victorian-era visual effects, like a Pepper's Ghost and stuff like that. And if you find the right stalactite and you pull on that, it opens a secret panel, and we remove part of the floor and put a circular staircase. And in the basement is a theater that has 18 seats, and it looks like it was once very luxurious, but has come to some kind of terrible end. And we're commissioning artists to do performances in that theater. So it's sort of a haunted house show, but it's really this idea of like a relentless reveal. Like, you know, it's like, what was that movie where they fall backwards? And they're in Inception. So it's a little bit our Inception show. And then for shows outside of there, we're working on a show for a space in New York that the Robert Rauschenberg Foundation has in Chelsea. It's a really nice space. It's actually amazing. It's the most beautiful garage I've ever seen. It was Robert Rauschenberg's crated storage facility. So art he had that was in crates hung out there, but it's like 4,000 square feet with a 20-foot ceiling and roll-up glass doors. So we're trying to figure out what to do there for the fall. That's what I'm working on next. Okay. Well, I said just one more question, and I kind of meant it. So I'm going to show you one more video, and then you can go on your way, and if there's something you want to ask, you can corner me afterwards, or you can peacefully disperse. So this is a very recent project we did. It was part of a commission. We commissioned 25 artists to respond to the Los Angeles landscape in some kind of performative sense. And so this is a piece by Carmina Escobar, who is an experimental extended technique opera singer that we work with from Mexico City, and she was responding to the Korean Bell of Friendship, which you will just see in the background of this video.
Once I start, because I ask them if I can touch them, they have to agree, and then I start with the back and slowly move into the chest, which is a very personal area. You go searching for the resonance between their body and your voice. So I just make these and I just start finding tones and pitches in which his bones is gonna like resonate with my face. So it's like back and forth. So when I feel good, then it's like the other people is feeling it. So that's pretty much the technique. Si se siente raro o algo, yo paro, ¿eh? Entonces, ¿qué voy a sentir? Vibraciones. Yo voy a vocalizar y cantar algo. Usually the way I work with the voice is without language. I just like the sound material as an object of itself. I like to think about the utterance, those sort of the things that interest me the most, as a sound, as a pure sound quality, and also because it relates to a human primordial thing. Listo.
Anyway, thank you guys so much.